Good morning, students. I hope you're well and staying safe. Let's just wait for a minute or two more before beginning today's lecture. By the way, before I commence, can all of you see the slides in full screen? Can you just give a show of hands?
Yes, we can see it.
Hello? Can you see the screen? Okay, wonderful.
We can see it. Can you hear me?
Let's just wait a minute before commencing. Thanks. Yes, I can actually hear you. I had my laptop on mute. I think I can hear you now. So first of all, let me begin by apologizing for all the confusion in the last during the last two supposed sessions. As you all are aware, I got diagnosed with COVID last week, which is why I couldn't travel. I was also not really doing well, was low on oxygen, but thankfully things have recovered. Things have improved since then. So I'm trying to get back by this weekend and hopefully begin the next lecture physically. But I'll keep you guys posted on the progress. I really hope to get back to Norway this weekend. And I'm really looking forward to teaching in class. So today we'll commence lecture 3. Before I begin, let me just give you a brief recap. Since we already had some time gap between the last lecture and today, let me start by discussing very briefly what we covered in the last lecture. So we started by looking at taking a deeper look at the role played by financial intermediaries. And then under that, we looked at two basic functions that they provide. One is their brokering function, which is basically they act as intermediaries between seekers and providers of capital. And more importantly, they also indulge in this process called qualitative asset transformation, wherein they facilitate changes in the characteristics of the capital that is being exchanged, whether that's in terms of the duration for which the money is being exchanged, being used or invested, the risk associated with the money, and various other characteristics such as the liquidity and things like that, right? If you're unclear on those, I strongly urge you to go back and look at the slides of lecture 2. Then we were briefly introduced to two kinds of information problems. One that exists pre-contractually, that is before money is exchanged, and that is broadly categorized as adverse selection. Second, we also looked at post-contractual information problems, that is information problems that might persist even after the exchange of capital has taken place, and that is broadly categorized under moral hazard. We also looked at the example of the marriage market to try and understand the role played by intermediaries in reducing search costs and therefore avoid duplication problems. So these are the two or three basic classes under which information problems can be segregated. And today we'll take a deeper dive into adverse selection and moral hazard and try and understand them more closely. We also talked a bit about how a financial system comprising these intermediaries evolves over time, evolves into its current form. And we try to understand that using the Goldsmith's anecdote, which showed how the monetary system moved from simple payment through gold to the usage of paper receipts as money, and how goldsmiths were incentivized to print more paper receipts in return for the incentive to make more money. And that creates moral hazard issues, because if there is some sort of a bank run, meaning there's a sudden increase in the number of deposit withdrawals, then the goldsmith is not in a position to tender or repay all those gold that he or she possesses or promises to pay. So to alleviate that problem, one solution was to create this banker of banks, or a lender of last resort, or a central bank as it is known today, who would step in and provide some kind of a temporary relief to any goldsmiths that face sudden withdrawal requests. But that also exacerbates, it increases the moral hazard problem, because now goldsmiths are incentivized to print more receipts, because they know that they can always fall back on this lender of last resort. So some kind of regulation is also necessary to ensure that goldsmiths do not print too much paper money. Then we also looked at the fixed coefficient model to understand how banks, or more precisely, their balance sheets, are interconnected with each other. Obviously, that has benefits in terms of releasing money into the economy through this process called deposit expansion. But at the same time, it also bears significant risks, because problem arising at one bank, maybe failure of one bank, can have ripple effects at other banks as well, simply because of the fact that their balance sheets are interconnected. Okay. So this was what we covered in the last lecture. I don't know if you have any questions on that. Do you? Okay, if not, then I'll proceed with today's lecture. So today we'll take a deeper look at how and why banks lend. So we'll look at the evolution of bank loans in general over time. And we'll also take a brief look at the elements, the ingredients of loan agreements. Okay. Then we'll spend a lot of time trying to understand adverse selection and moral hazard problem more closely. So under adverse selection, we'll discuss something called the Akerlof-Levens problem. And under moral hazard, we'll look at principal agent issues. And we'll try and understand how to identify, given a situation, how to identify what constitutes an adverse selection or a Levens problem, and what constitutes moral hazard or a principal agent problem. Lastly, we'll also look at how banks, for example, can resolve both adverse selection and moral hazard problems through something called credit analysis, and also through contract design, loan contract design. The relevant chapters for today's lecture are chapters 1 and 7. So I really urge you to go through both chapters and get back if you have any queries on either of them. So let's begin the first session today. So we'll take a deep dive as to how and why do banks lend. So generally speaking, lending is the main activity of any commercial bank. That constitutes a major source of its revenues, but it also constitutes a major source of its costs, right? Banks expend a lot of money and resources trying to screen borrowers, as we saw in the marriage market. And they typically provide loans of three types. One is loans made to firms and industries. These are typically called commercial loans. Then you have loans issued to fund the purchase of houses or any other type of real estate. So another category is real estate loans. Then third, you have consumer loans. So all your credit card loans and loans issued for students to fund their education, loans issued for the purchase of automobiles, all these fall under the category of consumer loans. Now, student loans might not be a big thing, at least to my knowledge in Norway, but in other countries such as the US and the UK, students have to take on huge amount of loans to fund their education through university. So consumer loans, especially student loans, form a big chunk of the lending activity of commercial banks. Okay, and I won't go again into the advantage that banks have over direct investment of capital. Obviously, they have better expertise and skill in screening borrowers, and they also have better skill at managing the money once it's issued as loan, right? Now, if you look at the evolution of commercial banks in general, until the mid 70s, you'll see that the major chunk of loans went out to the commercial sector. So a major part of lending activity of commercial banks comprise loans issued to firms and specific industries. But since the mid 70s, there's been a rapid financial innovation. New types of financial technologies have been introduced. We'll cover that briefly with respect to lending in the next lecture under securitization. And there's also been correspondingly a lot of deregulation happening, meaning a lot of other types of intermediaries like investment banks and hedge funds who were previously forbidden from indulging in any kind of lending activity were subsequently allowed to do so. So this increased competition within the lending market, and therefore this eroded the advantage that banks had in the lending in the loan sector. So banks have responded to that, to this increased competition by shifting their lending activity more towards the real estate market. Okay, which is why you see that this big bubble developing here, this big increase in the share of loans issued to the real estate market. Now, what kind of problems can this lead to? Any ideas? If banks increase or banks become overexposed to the housing sector, or let's say more generally to the real estate sector, what kind of issue do you think there could be any issues as a result of this overexposure problem?
They're like less diversified. So in case of something happening in the real estate market, they're very how do you say, like exposed?
Yeah. So from the bank's perspective, they are completely exposed to any shocks that occur in the real estate market. What about the consumers themselves, the borrowers? How does it affect them? Okay, let me split the question more in a more detailed manner. So if banks shift their focus towards the real estate market, what happens what is the first order effect that happens? What happens as far as the availability of home loans is concerned? Does it become easier or more difficult? It should ease, right? It should become easier for people to borrow money because banks are more willing to lend money towards the real estate market. So getting a loan itself becomes easy, right? Earlier, banks might have had stringent standards, stringent requirements in return for agreeing to lend money to purchase the house, to fund the purchase of a property. But now, because of banks' shift into the real estate market itself, availability of real estate credit becomes easy. Now, that incentivizes more and more people to take on loans to purchase a house. And what does that lead to? I don't know if you've been following the 2007 financial
Price increase?
Yeah, prices
increase in the house market.
Prices increase in the house market. More importantly, property developers are incentivized to build more and more homes and office real estate, right? It incentivizes the supply of real estate. So naturally, on one end, prices increase, lending becomes easy, and builders are incentivized to build more property. So you have a bubble developing in the housing market. Okay. Hold that thought until the next lecture, where we'll explore the concept of securitization and how it actually increased this overexposure problem. Okay. Next. Now, obviously, lending basically occurs when money is exchanged between a bank and a borrower, or between a capital seeker and a provider. But if you look at it more conceptually, there are actually at least three different ways to define this lending process. If you look at the first definition from the bank's perspective, a bank is basically as a result of providing the loan, it basically gets a claim over a certain part of the borrower's future cash flows. Okay. So one way to define lending is that it is a bank's illiquid claim against a certain proportion of the borrower's future cash flows, right? The borrower is getting money today from the loan, but the bank has a claim on the borrower's future cash flows into a subsequent period. Why is this claim illiquid? We talked about liquidity versus illiquidity of loans. Why is this claim illiquid? Any ideas?
If the borrower has used the cash he's borrowing on another asset, then it's hard for the bank to claim the loan or the cash back.
Indeed. So the bank cannot demand the borrower to repay at an instant. So if the loan is for 5 years and suddenly at the end of year 2, the bank goes to the borrower and says, oh, I have a sudden need, please pay me back my loan, it's not going to happen. If the bank asks you to repay your home loan today, even though the loan is valid for the next 30 years, you're in no position to repay the loan by the end of day, right? So therefore, any claim that the bank has on you or against your future cash flows is highly illiquid in nature. Flip the definition and look at it from the borrower's perspective. What is the borrower doing in return for obtaining the loan today? She is promising to repay that loan over the future period. In other words, she is actually selling her indebtedness today in return for making a promise that she'll repay the loan in the future. Okay. So the borrower is basically selling a future claim on herself to the bank. You can also look at it from a more legal standpoint, where lending is nothing but a legal claim held by the bank over a part of the borrower's future cash flows. Now, you might wonder why we are trying to define this in so many different ways. This is really important because you have two parties to a transaction, and it is important to understand the privileges, the roles and duties of both the bank and the borrower in this context. And this will also become more important when we talk about disintermediation and reintermediation in the next lectures. Okay. Now, obviously, what is the maximum amount a bank is willing to lend to a given borrower? Under the condition that the bank makes no profit, that is, charges no interest, the maximum amount that a bank is willing to lend to a borrower is nothing but the net present value of the future cash flows of the borrower over a certain period of time. Now, obviously, we have not covered net present value yet. I'm planning to do this in lecture 5, as I mentioned. So this concept will become much more clearer then. Okay. Coming to a loan agreement. A loan agreement is nothing but a contract. It's a legal contract. It's a legally binding contract which specifies the duties and obligations of both the bank and the borrower. What the bank and the borrower can do and cannot do as part of the loan agreement. It obviously contains information on certain terms of the loan, such as what is the interest rate the borrower is supposed to pay, how long is the loan being issued for, any kind of collateral that the borrower might have had to provide in return for obtaining the loan, and any processing fee that the bank charges in return for undertaking all the work to issue the loan and determine the credit worthiness of the borrower. Now, there are certain preconditions that the borrower has to satisfy. I know it's a bit descriptive here, but things will get interesting in the next 10 minutes, a lot more interesting. So borrower has to satisfy a lot of preconditions in return for in order to qualify for a loan. For example, they should not have any history of defaults. They need to have provided accurate information that is verifiable by the bank, meaning they need to provide a legally valid credit score. They need to provide certified documents about their employment status and their wealth and whatever. Now, apart from these conditions which are inserted into a loan agreement, there are also certain restrictions that the bank can place on what the borrower can and cannot do once the loan has been issued. So these are typically called covenants. And these are meant to minimize any post-contractual risk associated with the loan. Okay. What happens if any of these covenants get violated? Then the loan agreement also specifies what actions the bank can take to seek immediate repayment of that loan, or any kind of punishment that the bank can take in order to ensure that the borrower is repaying the loan on time. So all of these terms are set in the loan agreement. Okay. Now, all along, we've been talking about two types of information problems, especially in the lending context. One is adverse selection. And adverse selection, which is pre-contractual in nature, is often resolved through credit analysis. When it comes to resolving post-contractual moral hazard problems, that is mostly done through the design of the loan agreement and also through constant monitoring of the borrower by the bank. Now, obviously, the terms that go into the loan contract depend on the kind of information that is raised, the kind of information that is obtained through credit analysis. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Let's spend a few minutes on understanding adverse selection. Okay. Now, we have so far been talking about adverse selection in the context of lending or borrowing. And adverse selection basically arises when one party to an exchange has more information than the other parties, right? In the case of lending, the borrower obviously knows more about her true quality than the bank knows about her. So the question is, how can that information disparity or the information asymmetry be resolved? If you look at it more broadly, information problems can also exist between firms and their outsiders. So, insiders of these firms, like managers, like CEOs, CFOs, these are people who work within the firm. They have up-to-date knowledge of what's happening within the company. But if you contrast this with the knowledge that outsiders like investors or the banks possess about what's going on within the firm, obviously there is a big information gap. So insiders know more about the quality of the firm than outsiders themselves, right? What is a big issue that can happen when insiders know more about the firm than outsiders? What is the first thing that insiders might be incentivized to do?
They might be incentivized to benefit from it some way.
Yes,
because
exactly.
the market does not reflect the information that they might know.
Yeah, indeed. So insiders, if there are no proper safeguards, then insiders might actually be incentivized to take advantage of the information they possess, even if it is at the expense of outsiders. And this is what has led to a lot of insider trading scandals. Okay, so what do we mean by insider trading? Let me use an example here. So here you have this guy in the middle. His name is Rajaratnam. At one point, until I think 2011, he was the founder of one of the largest hedge funds in the US. Okay, he was basically an investor. Now, what Raj had cultivated over time was a number of important contacts with insiders at various firms. So you had people who were sitting on the boards of certain companies like Goldman Sachs, um, or you had this guy Rajiv, who was I think one of the executives in Intel. So he had developed contacts with insiders at various firms, and he was basically getting information from all these insiders well in advance of all the other investors in the market. That is, all the other outsiders. What use was this information? Raj, he basically used all this information to trade ahead of the market. Okay, he was able to trade well in advance of all the other investors and therefore make a killing. He, in fact, I think he made about 400 or $500 million of profit as a result of access to this inside information. Okay, and obviously this is considered illegal in many countries, and he was found guilty of indulging in insider trading, and I think he was sentenced to prison for almost 11 years. He just got released from prison. So obviously, the reason this insider trading happened was because there were not enough safeguards to prevent insiders from taking advantage of their information privilege. And that negatively affected all the outsiders out there, except obviously this guy. Okay, so you can clearly see the kind of major impact adverse selection problems can have on especially on outsiders, and it can affect them really badly. Okay. Now, this whole concept of adverse selection, where you have better informed actors such as insiders having an incentive to exploit their information their information advantage, this whole concept of adverse selection was devised by this professor called George Akerlof. In fact, he won the Nobel Prize for this in 2001. Now, the question he was trying to answer was that we know that insiders have an information advantage over outsiders, but given that, how can less informed actors like outsiders deal with this problem? That is, what kind of mechanisms can they employ to prevent informed insiders from taking advantage of their information access? That was the problem he was trying to tackle. Okay, so let's use a small numerical example to try and understand how adverse selection problems can have serious consequences. Okay, so that's the first part of the problem we'll try to tackle today under this session. So consider a market of used cars. These are second-hand cars. Okay. Now here you have two types of people. One is sellers And sellers obviously know the true quality of the car. But on the other hand, potential buyers don't really know about the true quality of a car. They're not allowed to assess the quality by visually inspecting it or through any other means. And basically here you have a market where sellers know much more about the quality of the cars than prospective buyers. Okay. Now the cars on sale can be categorized into three types of qualities. One is Q1 quality. Q1 is the best quality car available in the market, whereas quality type Q3 is the least or the worst quality type of car available in the market. Now, cars of type Q1 have a price of $10. Cars of type Q2 have a price of 5, and cars of type Q3 have a price of 0. Okay, they are called lemons because if you look at lemons, you cannot really assess how good the fruit is on the inside. Therefore, the most worthless goods on the market are typically called lemons, compared to better quality goods on the market, which are known as oranges or apples or whatever you can call them. Okay. Now remember, even though each car of a different quality has a certain price, the main problem affecting this market is that the buyers are unable to assess the quality of each of these cars precisely. So the natural instinct is to assign probabilities to each car type. So the buyers assign a probability of 0.4 that the car is of type Q1, that the car is of type Q2 with a probability of 0.2, and that the car is of type Q3 with a probability of 0.4. Okay. Now, obviously, we are dealing with utility maximizations here. We assume that the buyers and sellers are both rational. They are utility maximizing. So therefore, buyers will not want to pay more than the expected value of a car. And on the other hand, sellers will not want to sell for less than the expected value of a car. Okay. So the question is, given these criteria, at what price will a car get sold in this market? That's the question. So let's take 2 minutes and I'd urge each of you to try and answer the problem. Okay. What is the price at which a car will be sold in this market? So let's take 3 minutes and come back and discuss the solution. All right. Any answers? What is the final selling price of the car here? Of any car?
Is it 5?
Good attempt, but let's see the solution. It's a bit lower than that. Okay. Again, assuming that buyers are risk neutral, meaning they don't really care about the risk associated with a purchase. The first step, the first thing to do when you're given probabilities and prices is to compute the expected value of car given this information. So naturally, the first step would be to arrive at the expected value of any car, depending on 3 different qualities of cars available in the market, right? So how do you do that? Just multiply 10 times 0.4, which represents the expected value of a car given its type Q1. Then add that with 5 times 0.2, which represents the expected price of a car given its Q2, and same for Q3. So if you apply that, you'll see that the expected value of a car is 0.4 times $10, type Q1, right? Then 0.2 times $5, which is type Q2, and then 0.4 times 0, which is type Q3. Again, I'm just lifting the numbers from this table here. Okay. Obviously, I would have worked this out on the blackboard if I was in class. So from next lecture, we'll try and do that. So the expected value of a car is $5. So you're right. In the first stage, it's $5. But what happens once the expected value of a car is $5? Remember, sellers of type Q1, they want a minimum of $10 for selling the car. So naturally, cars of type Q1 cannot be sold because sellers are unwilling to accept a lower price. So all the sellers of type Q1 will drop out from this market. Okay, so the only types of cars available left in the market are Q2 and Q3. Okay, and these are available at a sale price of $5. What happens next? What is the next step you need to do?
So the probability of getting a lemon increases basically because you cannot get the premium cars.
Exactly. So you need to basically revise your expectations. Now, earlier you had 3 probabilities here, all summing to 1. Now one type of car drops out. So you basically need to revise your expectations here, right? Revise the probabilities such that they sum to 1. So all you need to do is revise the probabilities on hand. So now Q2 will become 0.2 by 0.2 plus 0.4. So you're basically revising the probabilities here by taking 0.2 divided by 0.2 plus 0.4, right? Similarly, the revised probability for type Q3 is 2 by 3. Remember, probability should always sum to 1. So what is under these new probabilities? You once again get a new expected price of the car, which is $1.67. Again, applying the same methodology as in step 1. So now the price is $1.67. What happens now? Sellers of type Q2 will not want to be in this market anymore because they demand a minimum price of $5. So all of them will drop out. Okay. So the only cars that are left in the market are of type Q3. They have a value of 0, a price of 0. But under these revised expectations, the expected value of a car is now $1.67. And buyers are certainly unwilling to pay $1.67 for a car that is completely worthless. So the net result here is, I mean, you can also represent this pictorially. I'll upload the slides later on so that you can visualize the solution in a way and try and get a bit more better intuition of how these numbers are worked out. Now, what happens in the end is that as expectations get revised over time, you ultimately have only cars of type Q3, which have a real value of 0, but have an expected value of $1.67. So buyers will not be willing to pay 1.67, and therefore they'll drop out from the market. So the net result is that the market does not clear. You clearly have a case of market failure here. No cars will ever be bought or sold. Okay, this problem exists because buyers are unable to determine the true quality of a car, and therefore they continually use probabilities to arrive at an expected value. And it so turns out that the expected value is always greater than the price that the buyers are willing to pay, and it's mostly lower than the price that sellers are willing to sell. So you can clearly see that adverse selection can have serious problems in this market. It can in fact lead to market failure. And remember, this is adverse selection because this is pre-contractual. No sale has ever taken place, right? So you can, so you see adverse selection problems exist, but that's only the first part of the problem. Here, we have so far established that adverse selection problems exist in this market. But now the bigger question is, what kind of mechanisms can we use to prevent that such a market breakdown from occurring? How can, what kind of mechanisms can, let's say, better quality sellers adopt in order to be able to distinguish themselves from sellers of poor quality cars, right? They need to, is there any kind of solution that sellers of better quality cars adopt in order to make themselves look different or be seen as different from sellers of poorer quality cars, and therefore be successful in convincing buyers to pay a higher price and purchase their cars? In other words, basically make the market work. So that's the question. Okay. So let me get back to the problem once again. Again, we have three types of cars. Each have the same prices. I mean, Q1 has a price of 10, Q2 has a price of 5, and Q3 has a price of 0. But now we have some new information. Each car has a certain probability of engine failure. So cars of type Q1 have a probability of 0.1 that the engine will fail. Cars of type Q2 have a 50% probability that the engine might fail. Obviously, cars of type Q1 have a lower engine failure probability because they're better quality cars. And cars of type Q3 are certain to fail with a probability 1 if they ever get sold. Okay. Now, again, we have the same information, adverse selection problem. Sellers know more about the true quality of the car than potential buyers. And buyers cannot observe the quality of a car directly. They cannot assess the quality directly. So the question is, given this information, how can you make this market work? In other words, how can, let's say, sellers of type Q1 distinguish themselves from sellers of type Q2 and Q3? And how can Q2 distinguish themselves from sellers of type Q3? That's the question. So what do you think is a solution to this problem? Any ideas? Remember, if any of you have purchased cars, apart from buying a car, what else do you buy on top of it?
Insurance, I guess.
Yeah, you buy an insurance contract. Why do you buy insurance?
To protect yourself from the future risks.
Yeah, and also ensure that the auto company pays you something if something happens, like an accident or some kind of mishap occurs with your car. You always know that you'll get paid upfront, especially if it's not your mistake. If you're involved in a collision with someone else, then for any kind of repairs, you might need some money, and the insurance contract basically guarantees that you'll get some money back as a result of purchasing the contract, right? Yeah, or it's these are also known as warranties. So one mechanism by which sellers of different types of cars can distinguish themselves is by providing guarantees. So what do we mean by guarantees here? Sellers of type Q1 can promise to pay back G1, an amount G1, if the engine of car type Q1 fails. Okay. Similarly, sellers of type Q2 can promise that they'll pay back an amount G2 to the buyer. Sorry, there's a typo here. This is buyer. If the engine of that car fails, and obviously Q3 promises nothing because they implicitly know that their cars are worthless. Now, the obvious challenge here is that sellers of type, it's only sellers of type Q1 should be able to offer G1 as a guarantee. If sellers of type Q2 also manage to offer a guarantee of G1, then once again, the market is unable to distinguish between the cars of two types. Similarly, sellers of type Q3 should not be able to offer a guarantee of amount G1 or G2, because otherwise, once again, the market fails to clear. So the question is, how can you ensure that only sellers of type Q1 are able to offer a guarantee G1? How can you ensure that only sellers of type Q2 offer a guarantee of G2 and Q3 offer some other guarantee G3? Okay. Naturally, when sellers are offering guarantees, then the buyers must also be willing to pay an extra fee for purchasing those guarantees. So that's the condition imposed here. Okay. So I'll not provide you the full solution. We'll discuss the solution in the next class, but I would like you to think harder and come up with estimations of what are these amounts G1, G2, depending on the information that is given to you in this table here and all the conditions imposed in this problem. Okay. So in the next lecture, at the beginning, we'll discuss the solution to this problem. But in the meantime, please do work it out. These are really good examples, and this will give you some practice of how to work out numerical problems of this nature. Okay. Any questions on this question on this problem so far? Any more clarifications you might require? Okay. I'm not going to give you all the solutions here, but now it's almost 11. So before moving on to the next session, which is on moral hazard, let's take a 15-minute break. If you're interested, you can even try solving the problem during this break, and I'm happy to discuss the solutions in that case. Okay, but ideally, I would push the discussion of the solution to the next lecture. Okay, so let's get back at 11:15 and continue with the second session of the lecture. Cheers. All right, let's get started with the second session. By the way, did anyone attempt the previous problem? Doesn't have to be entirely correct, but you could give me some pointers on maybe how you try to solve the question. That'll be useful. Okay, if not, then take the week. We have the next class on Wednesday. So we'll discuss the problem during that session, but I'd really urge you to try and solve the problem and get some hands-on practice. Okay, so in the second part, we'll focus more on moral hazard problems, which are post-contractual in nature, right? And usually these occur when there are deviations in the terms of an agreement of an exchange. So if you look at the blending context, here you have banks and borrowers, which basically exchange loans, and they exchange money on the basis of a loan agreement. Now, it is quite likely possible that the borrower might deviate from the terms of the agreement. And this creates a big moral hazard problem as long as the bank is unable to monitor the borrower effectively or doesn't have strong points within the agreement in place to ensure that the borrower does not deviate from the terms of the agreement. More generally, moral hazard occurs between what is known as a principal and an agent. So here, you can think of a principal as a bank, right? What does the bank do? The bank delegates authority over something to the agent. So in this case, the bank is delegating the authority on choosing how to spend money to the agent, who's the borrower. So that's how, given a situation, if you decide it's a moral hazard problem, right? This occurs post-contract. This occurs once the loan has been issued. Then the question is to determine who is the principal and who is the agent in that situation. Whoever delegates authority over something, such as the usage of money, is the principal. And whoever gets authority to use money or to determine how it should be spent or invested, that's the borrower. Now, the agent makes decisions on behalf of the principal. Okay, the bank is the one providing money, but it's the borrower, the agent, who's getting to decide how to invest, how best to utilize that capital, right? Now, here, both the principal and the agent have certain expectations of how the money will be utilized. The bank expects that the borrower will repay the loan on time, right? That the borrower will not default on her loan and ensure that all the terms of the agreement are strictly followed. But there is a chance that the borrower may not wish to repay the money. Unless there are proper safeguards in place, the borrower may simply run away, may default on her loan, and the principal will get affected as a result of the agent's actions, as a result of the borrower's actions. So here you have a principal-agent conflict where the actions of the borrower might not negatively impact the borrower. They might in fact positively affect the borrower, the agent, but they could have a detrimental effect. They could have a negative effect on the interests of the principal. So this is a case where you have a principal-agent problem. Okay. Now, the question is, how can you resolve this principal-agent problem? Now, obviously, we are still dealing in a rational world where agents will try to maximize their expected utilities. And obviously, the principal will suffer if the agent's actions conflict with the interests of the principal. So therefore, the key condition to resolve this principal-agent problem, or the model hazard problem, is to design a contract that aligns the interests of the principal with that of the agent. So the key to resolving moral hazard issues, or more broadly principal-agent problems, is to achieve incentive alignment between the principal and the agent. Okay. Now, look at it from a different perspective. Let's take another example here. Let's say you have a house that is worth $1,000, but then you purchase an insurance on your house that promises to pay $2,000 if there is any incident like a fire. Now here, the insurance company is the principal, right? It is delegating authority to you, the borrower, on how you'll use the money, right? Or how you'll maintain the property. And you are the agent because you're promising the insurance company that you will keep your house in order. You'll keep it properly well maintained, and you'll make sure that there is no fire. But look at the difference between how much your house is worth and what the insurance company promises to pay if there is any fire, right? It's double of what your house is worth. So naturally, you as an agent might be tempted to set your own house on fire and claim the insurance. So the question is, what kind of preventive measures can the insurance firm adopt to prevent you from doing such to prevent you from taking such an action? That is the key problem that is addressed under principal agent issues. Okay. Now, let's take a small example. Again, this is kind of like a homework exercise for you. And again, I'll discuss the solution for this problem in the next lecture, but we'll try and use this example to understand how moral hazard affects principals and agents. Okay, so here consider a firm that has an ongoing project. It is already engaged in a project and it has an ongoing loan of $100. So it already has an obligation of $100 at T is 0. At T is 0, the firm has two choices. It can either pay a $100 dividend to its existing shareholders, one-time cash payment, or it can choose to invest $30 in a project and pay the remaining $70 as a dividend to its existing shareholders. So this happens at T is 0. Now, depending on whether the firm invests in the project or not, the firm earns certain payoffs at T is 1. If the firm doesn't make an investment and pays out $100 to its shareholders, then depending on how the project outcome is, it can either make $110 in a good scenario or $70 in a bad scenario. If, on the other hand, the firm invests in the project, $30, then under a good outcome, the project will earn about $200 at TS1 and only $5 if the project goes bad. Now, let's assume that the firm will close down at TS1 and it has to repay the loan of $100. Okay. Remember one condition. Whenever you have two types of outsiders within the firm, on one end you have banks, or more generally debt holders, and on the other hand you have shareholders, always the banks will get paid first and shareholders will only get paid afterwards with whatever money is left in the end. Okay. So when the firm closes at TS1, the first thing it has to do is repay the loan of $100. Okay. Only then will it be able to pay any dividend to shareholders at TS1. Again, assume there are no taxes, there's no discount rate and whatever. The firm's goal ultimately is to maximize shareholder wealth. So given this situation, you have two questions. One is, should the firm invest in the project? That's the first question to answer. And if the firm decides to invest in the project, who gains from this investment? Is it the banks or the shareholders that make more money as a result of that decision? So try and solve this problem and try and see who benefits and who loses. Do both benefit or do both lose? If you find any discrepancy, try and explain it using the concepts of moral hazard. Why did one party gain more and why did one party gain less or lose money? So we'll try and address these questions by solving this problem. Okay. So take some time. Again, during the course of the week, if you have any questions when trying to solve these problems, I'm happy to address any of your concerns. Okay. All right. So we'll come down to the last part of this lecture, which is credit analysis. So as we have seen all along, one of the main objectives of a bank in determining whether to issue a loan to a given borrower is to collect as much information as possible in order to determine the borrower's creditworthiness, their willingness to repay, and in fact, their ability to repay, right? So the bank collects every piece of available information to ascertain the borrower's track record. And this data, the information that is collected, can not only be used to process a current loan and make a lending decision, but it can also be reused for future loan requests. Should the given borrower come back at a later date and make an additional loan request, then the same information can be used to make a decision at that point. Now, credit analysis is the process through which banks determine the creditworthiness and the willingness and the ability of the borrower to repay. And credit analysis basically comprises of 5 C's: capacity, character, capital, collateral, and governance. Okay. Now, we'll try and look at each of these different C's one after the other. If you look at the first C, which is capacity, this basically determines the ability as well as the eligibility of the borrower to take on the loan. Okay. What do we mean by ability? First, by ability, we mean financial capacity. Obviously, a bank is going to lend to somebody only if it believes that they are in a position to repay over a future period of time. So the first question facing the bank when it comes to determining capacity is to estimate the kind of future cash flows that the borrower is likely to generate, or whether the borrower has enough wealth. If the loan is being raised by a firm, then the question is whether the firm will be able to generate enough cash in the future to be able to make those yearly repayments, right? Then the second question with determining capacity is also to understand whether the firm or the borrower has taken on any other loans from all the other banks out there. Does it have any other outstanding loans parallelly? And the last part is if the borrower has multiple loans ongoing at the same time, then the question is, in what order will those loans be repaid? So that's also an important consideration, because then it's not only a question about whether the borrower has sufficient cash flows to generate in the future. The question is also about in what order will those loans be repaid? Will some other bank's loan be paid first before the current loan is paid, or vice versa. So that's the question facing the bank. There's also the question of legal capacity. Does the bank or the person who's requesting a loan on the behalf of a certain firm have the legal authority to do so? If the person requesting a loan, for example, is the CEO, then he or she might have to provide sufficient documentation to determine to prove that they have the legal authority to request a loan on that firm's behalf. So they need to provide proper paperwork to that end. The second C is character. Now, we talked about the financial capacity and the legal capacity of a firm or a person to request loans. The second part is also character, which is the willingness to repay. That obviously depends on the borrower's credit history, their past record, and their behavior. Have they been repaying loans in the past properly on time? Have they faced any legal action for probably defaulting on loans? And if they were unable to repay in the past, what conditions forced them or put them in a situation that they were unable to repay? So this is another important consideration facing banks under credit analysis. Obviously, if a prospective borrower has a better credit reputation, then that means they have a lesser likelihood of default, and therefore they stand a better chance of repaying those loans. Now, again, we come back to the concept of net present value, where the borrower is expected to not default if the net present value of the loan that is being requested is greater than the loan amount defaulted, right? So in that case, the borrower will not default as long as the value from repaying those loans is greater than the value that accrues to the borrower from defaulting on those loans. So again, borrowers constantly face a trade-off between deciding whether to keep repaying those loans or deciding whether to default on a given loan. So we'll see this in the case of peer-to-peer lending. We'll borrow this equation when determining when exactly will a borrower decide to default on a loan. Okay. And if the borrower has a better credit reputation, then he or she also has access to loans at a cheaper rate. So that's also an important outcome if the borrower's character is found out to be really good. Okay. Third is the important concept of capital. Now, capital is we are not talking about the loan itself, but about the money that the borrower has and is willing to invest from her own pocket. Now, remember, when you purchase a house, I don't know how many of you have done that, but whenever you purchase a house, the bank is not going to fund 100% of the value of that property. The bank will actually require you to fund at least a certain percentage of the property's value using your own savings, right? Typically, it can be from 5% to even 20 or 30%. Why is the bank doing that? Why is the bank insisting that you fund a part of your own house using your own savings? Why does that? Why does the bank insist on that? Any ideas?
Maybe to minimize moral hazards. If a person has invested a portion of their own money, they are less likely to run away with it or run away with the loan or do something else with it.
Yeah. And you're also more likely to maintain the value of your property because you have a stake in it, right? Or if you invest in a given project, then at least partly from your own money, using your own money, then you're more likely to ensure that the project will not fail. So by capital under credit analysis, we mean what is the commitment of a borrower to the project or the area in which or the asset in which the money is being invested. Capital determination is necessary to ensure that the borrower will stick to the terms of the loan agreement and continue to repay the loan without defaulting. Okay. Again, this is an important consideration in resolving adverse selection problems. Okay. And also achieving incentive alignment post-contract between the banks and the borrowers. Now, when a borrower invests her own capital into a given project along with the loan, then it also serves as a signaling mechanism to the bank, indicating the borrower's commitment to that project. Okay, so it also serves as a mechanism to resolve moral hazard. And by investing her own capital, it is highly likely that the borrower will not abandon it or will make every effort to ensure that the project or wherever the money is being invested makes decent returns. Now, if that doesn't, if capital commitment is not there, right? If the bank doesn't insist on a borrower to put her own money, then obviously things are going well. If the project performs well, then the loan is repaid and the borrower can keep whatever remaining profits are there. But if the project underperforms, then the borrower might not have an option but to run away and abandon the project, meaning the bank will face any losses that might occur from the failure of the project. But by committing her own capital, the bank is reducing the chances that the borrower will abandon any project. And more importantly, when the borrower also puts her own money, she is also unlikely to take on too much risk when investing in projects. She is likely to be careful in choosing her projects and only going for those that are less risky. So it also ensures, the capital commitment also ensures that too much risk is not taken by the borrower. On the other hand, if the entire money is coming from the bank, then the borrower might be less careful, might be more open to taking on more risk because it's not her money. So these are some considerations before the bank. Okay. The fourth C is called collateral. So collateral are basically assets provided by the borrower as a guarantee in return for obtaining the loan. So remember, when you purchase a house, you get a loan to fund the purchase of that property, but the house itself, the papers, the deed for that house is held by the bank until that loan is repaid. Why is the bank doing that? Why is the bank keeping the papers of your house? Any ideas? What happens if the loan fails? If the borrower defaults? What can the bank do in that case?
Sell the house.
Sell the house. Why is the bank doing that? To recover
So they can
whatever.
claim.
Yeah. To
Yeah.
recover the loan amount as much as possible. So the house that is held by the bank for the duration of the loan is known as collateral. It's basically a guarantee held by the bank against the borrower in return for getting the loan. Okay. Now, depending on the information that is obtained by the bank from the credit analysis, the amount of collateral demanded by the bank might be even more than the value of the loan itself, or it might be less than the value of the loan, depending on how risky the bank perceives the borrower to be. In some cases where borrowers have really good relationships with banks, sometimes banks might not even require a collateral in return for providing the loan. But again, it all depends on how risky the bank perceives the borrower to be. Some of you who will go on to do more hardcore finance courses will come across these terms called secured and unsecured loans. So secured loans are basically loans that come with collateral provision, because the loan there is secured against certain collateral held by the bank. Now, in the case of a secured loan amounts typically tend to be higher. Larger loan amounts are issued in return for providing collateral, and also they come at cheaper rates. On the other hand, if you contrast secured with unsecured loans are much more risky for the bank, and therefore the loan amounts in those cases tend to be lower, and they also they also tend to be more expensive for the borrower because they come with higher interest rates. Okay. Now, one thing you should remember is that, of course, collateral helps reduce the moral hazard problem, because as long as your house is held with the bank, you will ensure that you keep repaying the money. Otherwise, you might lose the property. But another important thing is that the quality of the collateral itself might change over time, right? So the bank needs to ensure that the borrower will not take actions that worsen the quality of the collateral over the duration of that loan. So for example, if you purchase a house with a bank loan, but you don't maintain it really well, then it's not you who's suffering ultimately. It's the bank that is losing value on that collateral. So the bank should ensure that the borrower doesn't take any such actions. So one way to do that is that the bank will send people every few years who will do an inspection of your property and ensure that it is in good standing. So that is basically a monitoring exercise done by the bank, which obviously entails certain costs, but that is important to ensure that the quality of the collateral does not deteriorate over time. Now, if the borrower defaults, the collateral provided will typically go to the bank. And this collateral can be sold by the bank to recover the loan amount. Okay. Often what happens in the real world is that collaterals tends to be sold at a discount. All houses that get foreclosed, that get taken over because of borrower defaults, they tend to be sold in the second-hand market, and most often these are sold at a heavy discount, meaning the banks are unable to recover the entire loan amount, and sometimes banks have gone bankrupt as a result of that. Okay. Now, here's another example. This example requires some working knowledge of net present value, but we will try to understand the importance of collateral using this example. So I'll discuss this when we run some exercises on net present value. But this is a really cool example that tries to understand how collateral changes borrowing decisions. Okay, I'll introduce this problem later on when we discuss net present value. Last part of the last C of credit analysis are covenants. Okay. By the way, do you have any questions so far? Feel free to raise your hands or just speak up. The last part of credit analysis are called covenants. So basically, these are restrictions that are imposed on the borrower and that determine the kind of actions that a borrower might or might not be able to take. Okay. These are once again put into a loan agreement to ensure that moral hazard problems are minimized from the bank's perspective. And these restrictions, I mean, there's no set covenants that are imposed by the bank. The imposition of covenants depends on how risky the bank perceives the borrower to be. So you might have two different borrowers borrowing the same amount of money, but one might face a lot more covenants than the others in the loan agreement. Okay, it all depends on their financial status, whether they have defaulted on prior loans, how much wealth they have, what kind of actions they have taken with the money that they have borrowed in the past, and various other factors. Okay. Generally speaking, covenants can be broken down into two types. One type of covenants are less restrictive, meaning they're only put in place to ensure that the borrower is able to repay the loan on time. Okay. In other words, these type of covenants are meant to ensure that the borrower does not face any riskiness as far as her ability to generate future cash flows are concerned. Now, one type of such covenants are affirmative covenants. Okay. Here, the borrower is simply required to provide financial statements, let's say every quarter, to the bank so that the bank can keep track of her performance. So the bank will typically put a condition into the loan agreement stating that the borrower must do this regularly, which is not very costly for the borrower to do so. Compared to that, you have something called restrictive covenants, which are basically meant to prevent any misuse of money, especially the money issued through the loan for unnecessary or illegal purposes. So, for example, a restrictive covenant could be something like the bank cannot divert any cash or excess cash to shareholders, or it cannot use the loan money to pay salaries to CEOs or whatever. So that's another type of restrictive covenant. Then you have a second category of covenants, which are much more restrictive. And these are basically meant to ensure that the borrower doesn't default on the loan. So these are more stringent. These come with a lot of punishments. So you have negative covenants under which the borrower cannot take certain actions without the bank's explicit approval. So for example, if the borrower wants to raise a new loan from another bank, then a negative covenant might require that the borrower take permission from the current bank. Okay. Sometimes you might also have other types of negative covenant stating, for example, that the borrower can only take loans up to a certain ratio. For example, only 7 times the ratio of profits made by the company during a given year. So that's another type of negative covenant, which prevents the company from taking on too many loans. So that's also another covenant imposed into a loan agreement if the bank feels that the borrower might take on too much risk. Last and most stringent types of covenants are called default provisions. So these are actions that the bank can take under the terms of the loan agreement should the borrower default on her loan. The most restrictive default provision is that the bank can seek immediate repayment if the borrower defaults. If the borrower fakes any financial data, for example, if the borrower misrepresents herself, then she might also be liable to, she might also be taken to court. She might also face some jail time. So all these violations can be prevented by instituting certain relevant covenants in place. Okay, or even in some extreme cases, you might also have a borrower selling her firm to somebody else without taking permission from the bank or without bothering to repay the loan. So the bank can take punitive actions to prevent such an occurrence from happening. Okay, but again, default provisions are the most restrictive types of actions or covenants that a bank can put into a loan agreement. Okay, I also provided some extra slides in case you want to go through them, but again, these are very optional. But this brings us to the end of today's lecture. I strongly urge you to try out the numerical problems. These are slightly lengthier, so I thought I'd rather discuss them in class than spend a few minutes and allow you to work over it. So take some time, try those two numerical problems, see how you can. It also requires a bit of creative thinking from your side to arrive at the solution. So I hope you'll find this interesting and try and come up with the solution yourself. Okay, any questions? Okay, if not, then we have come to the end of today's lecture. Again, I really hope the next lecture will be physical, and I hope to see all of you there. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.